Val Scholtz, thank you for coming to the show.
Thank you for hosting.
Without further ado, let's just go straight into it. Please tell us who you are, what you do, and most importantly, why do you do it?
All right. I founded a company called Kiko. So essentially what we're trying to do is to allow landlords to rent out the flat deposit-free directly to the tenants, while offering better protection against damages and also getting a rent insurance guarantee.
And why do you do that?
It's just like, I lived in different places. I lived in Vienna, Milan, Lisbon, and also London. And I feel like the way people rent properties or rent out properties hasn't really been innovated in the last 30, 50, 100 years. And there's a lot of room for improvements in terms of like how you can find properties, how you can actually live in a property and how you communicate with your landlord, but also in terms of a landlord, how you can reduce the risk for offering their flat to tenants.
So I'd say property real estate is one of the biggest industries. So much money exchanges hands so rapidly. It takes such a huge part of people's lives and paychecks, and hasn't been disrupted in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
We had the co-working spaces and the likes, but innovation that meets the everyday consumer, I can't really think of anything I've used. So thank you for doing that. As someone who is country hopping myself, what a freaking nightmare. So that's Kiko. How long have you been doing that?
So we started November last year, so November 2019.
Okay, so that's 3 months on the road.
Yeah, it's a good journey so far. We raised our pre-seed round, hired a team, and now basically are working hard to deliver the final product to end consumers in London this summer.
That's excellent. So when do you expect the launch? This summer?
Yeah, this summer.
Okay. Will there be a party?
Depends on how successful the launch is. But I think, we should celebrate that we launched. But then the way I see it is we're just at the beginning. So we launched in London. We want to prove our business model. And then once we have that, we start expanding internationally. So we already have plans for New York, for LA, San Francisco, Berlin, Paris, basically every big city in the world. And I think it's something that everybody in the world can benefit because everybody has to live somewhere.
So for a company that's been on the road for 3 months, haven't launched still, you are dreaming quite big. Where did this tendency to dream big came from?
You should set yourself big targets, right? If you go backwards, everybody needs to rent a property or own a property, but you need to live somewhere. It's like one of the basic things that humans need. You need a roof or a bed somewhere, you need to eat, and you need to sleep. Everything else you could argue, but these things are non-negotiable. And considering like how the whole market is on a global scale and how bad it's still solved to do these things, which is basically considering like we build a product that people actually like using. We don't really see a ceiling unless you hit actually 8 billion people. So I think it's good to set yourself good targets and then have a vision in front of you and then work hard to get closer to it.
I would argue that some people avoid making important and well-needed changes in their life because they are struggling to move apartments. They are struggling to uproot themselves from where they've been for the last 3, 4, 5 years. And maybe partially part of that can be solved by Kiko. We'll go back to that in a second, because I really think that having a big vision and gigantic plans, but also being only 3 months on the road, it requires either complete ignorance and not knowing what this task entails, or it requires something a little different. Experience, belief, hunger. Is that something you grew up with? Is that something you learned from your parents, or is that something you acquired through work? Where is that motivation coming from?
I don't know, no idea. It's the honest answer. I just feel like, whatever I did in my life, I wanted to be the best. If you play a game with friends, you want to win. What's the point of losing? Then you don't have to play the game. And then, in the end of the day, it's always kind of like a game. Like, what's important in your life is your friends, family, like, and professional things is for me more like a competition. It's like if you play football, you want to win the championships, you want to win the cups, I don't know, the World Cup. But at the end of the day, that's your job, right? And there's other things in life that matter more.
What does the World Cup look for you?
Well, having 8 billion customers.
So 7,999,000,000 customers, just not just enough.
Well, there's still one more thing.
And before Kiko, can you tell us a little bit about your journey? Because you've done a bunch of work. You've been a software engineer, you've been the head of design, you've been chief product officer, and then you've led growth in 2 different companies.
Yeah. So recently I worked for a company called Revolut, which is one of the fastest growing companies in the world. I joined when there were roughly 100 employees. I left when there were roughly 2,000. Basically my job was to help the company grow faster by acquiring more customers and making sure that the acquired customers understand the value and benefit of Revolut and ideally use it on a daily basis.
Let's zoom out on the Revolut conversation for 1 second. London is the capital of fintech in the world, arguably. Very, very competitive marketplace with a lot of strong legacy players. VCs, investment funds, banks, obviously. And then comes this whole fintech revival, this challenger banks revival.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that landscape in which you're operating in?
Yeah, I think the whole thing happened after the financial crisis. I think the UK and also the European Union were probably the first regulator that basically invented a new framework which allowed smaller companies to compete with established players. So if you think about big banks have billions of cash, and it's very hard for a small startup which has maybe $500,000 or a few millions to compete against that. Because it's just to get a banking license and to get the cash that you need to hold balances outweighs what you can achieve with a small company. So after the financial crisis, basically, the regulators thought about how can we make finance more transparent and have more competition. And they created something called the e-money license, which is used by a lot of different companies, not just challenger banks, but also investment platforms or insurance companies. And I think that regulation or the regulatory framework, which allowed companies like Revolut, Monzo, Moniz, and many others to actually start building their product, start offering their product to customers, and then ultimately grow into sustainable scale-up or even enterprise.
And you've had startup experience coming into Revolut as the 100th employee.
Yeah, my whole journey was a bit random. So I used to play semi-professional football in my youth. And when I was roughly 14, you kind of have to make a decision if you want to try to become a professional or if you basically, finish school, go studying, these sort of things. So ultimately, I decided that it's a bit too risky to become a professional football player. Also because at that time, footballs didn't earn that much. And, it was usually common that you maybe play 10 years, 8 years professionally, and then you kind of you don't have much education, you don't have much experience, and a lot of them basically struggle to find good jobs. So basically when I chose to not become a professional football player, I suddenly had a lot of free time, and I somehow ended up playing Counter-Strike with friends. And usually you play 5-on-5, so you have your team and you want to showcase your team and your results. So I went to my mom and I was like, hey, we want to have a website. Can you give me some money? And my mom was basically saying no. And she was basically like, I'm not giving you money, but here's a book. Do it yourself. And I think for me, it was always, if people told me I can't do something, I always wanted to prove them wrong. I don't know why. I just want to. And so I basically spent day and night to build my first website. And then I actually enjoyed doing that process because it felt very similar to playing Lego and doing something technical. And essentially, I ended up studying design so that the website looks nicer. And then other teams basically approached me and were like, hey, can you build a website for us too? We even pay you. And so that's how I basically ended up starting with the whole startup scene.
In a 2016 article, you've been quoted, I started a couple of startups in the past and I've probably did every mistake possible.
Yeah, I think, I think in general, like how to build a company or even like how to do product or growth, it's very hard to learn because you can't really go to uni. Like nowadays, so the whole thing started back in the days from Hewlett Packard, and they basically had the first product managers. And so usually companies were run by business people, and it kind of like changed with Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and these sort of people. And essentially what happened is that Steve Jobs, because although he was a business person, he was very product centric. He understood how electronics works and how to actually, how this whole machinery works, how to improve things, why design is so important. He basically created something new and added a lot of product managers that had a different approach to work, a more scientific approach. But the issue was like everything you learned in unis was completely different to that approach. So the only way actually to get that knowledge was to be in Silicon Valley and to get taught by these people that are actually working. And then so over time, these people expanded from not just, Apple, but also to Microsoft and to other startups like Facebook and Amazon, and they spread the knowledge more in the world. I think it's similar in business. You basically need mentors. You need people that help you to understand, what works and what doesn't work. And it involves a lot of mistakes on the road because essentially you try to create something that didn't exist before. So if you look at a company like Revolut, like how they started was basically by offering free currency exchange, and that just didn't exist before. I mean, if you wanted to send money from, let's say, the United Kingdom to the United States, you always had to pay a markup on the exchange rate. You always had to pay fees for the transfer. And you basically even lost usually around 5 to 10% just on that transfer. And it's the same like if you traveled abroad, you always lost with every single payment, with every time you went to the ATM, you lost a lot of money. I think that's why it's so hard, because you're trying to achieve something that nobody ever achieved before. So there's not really like guidelines or anything like how you can do this, right? So the most important thing is like your approach and your process and how you actually solve a problem and how you can get closer to that goal. And I think the only way nowadays to learn this is by actually working in companies that achieved it and learning from the inside how to do these things. Because it's very hard from the outset to know which part actually made a difference and which part didn't.
So if you had to close or discontinue certain startups that you've started, how did you know it was time to shut them down and move on?
I think most people start the wrong way of startup. Like you should start a startup because you want to solve a problem. Sometimes you see an opportunity, but it's usually a problem that exists in real life. So if you think about Facebook, Facebook just made it easier for people to connect online. They brought that community that existed already offline, just online. And by doing this, they helped people to stay in touch with people that might relocate to different cities or different countries. But in general, they didn't really reinvent something. They basically just made a process that already existed more efficient. Or if you look at Revolut, people already traveled before, they already sent money before. Revolut just made it simpler and cheaper. You could say the same about Uber, about Airbnb, about literally every big company. I think the biggest learning for me was basically to think first about what is the problem you're solving, and is that problem painful enough for a lot of people that they would willing to switch what they're doing right now to your solution. And I think most startups never succeed because they don't actually solve something that people really care about. They create something that sounds cool.
And going back to the Revolut days, so you were the 100th employee of a company that was in a busy marketplace, but were there ever any signs for how successful the company is going to become?
Yeah. Personally, I've never met a founder like Nick. I mean, he was extremely dedicated to work, extremely focused, extremely hardworking, and he created like a culture around him to have people with a similar ambition, that basically just want to succeed at all costs, and people that just want to prove to what they're capable of, and also believing in the product, believing what the company wants to achieve and why they want to achieve it.
So when you look at all the things that Revolut had to offer you back then, so you could when you were signing the contract, you're signing, okay, a team I believe in or founders I believe in, check. A product I believe in, checked. Timing,
I think timing is very hard to know, right? So for example, the first electric car was like, it's 100 years old. Probably the timing wasn't right. It's very difficult to know when the right time is. And often you just know it afterwards. That's why not every, like you could see some signs that it's probably the right timing because the regulatory change and in general, like how, that it's a market that's quite outdated. It wasn't disrupted for a long time and it's still very painful to use. But it could be that, the timing is right now. So it wasn't like 5 years ago. It could be the timing is in 5 years. Yeah. It's very hard to know these things.
There's so much I want to ask you about companies whose growth mentality you admire, and I'm sure we'll go back to that. But before moving on with those questions, I wanna know the difference between being the 100th employee of a startup. Okay, there's some promise, there's some money in the bank. They obviously know at least a little bit of what they're doing. And then the company, when it reaches 2,000 people. So what was Revolut like when you were 100 employees and you knew the names of everyone in the office?
Well, it was very startup mode. Very fast moving. Every individual had a lot of responsibility. You had to be a very good all-rounder because essentially you needed to, there was no space for like experts in fields. Like you just had to do what needs to be done. And it doesn't matter if you can do it or not. You basically just had to learn it if you can't. And I think like the bigger you get, the more discipline in terms of organizational design you need. And people can't do whatever they want anymore. They actually have to specialize on a particular field in order that the company still moves fast.
So a lot of autonomy. Many projects that haven't been done before, not for this company, not at all. So you have to figure a lot of things out. Was it a tolerant environment for trial and error?
Yeah, obviously, it's like, in a way, basically, like Nick, so the CEO, basically, he gave everyone targets. Like, there were certain metrics that we needed to hit in terms of, like, how many users we need to acquire on a daily basis, how much revenue we need to make, what kind of, activation rates we need to hit, and so on.
That's not different from any other company that's commercially savvy?
No, I think it's, in general, like you shouldn't do work just for the sake of doing work. You should have a goal in mind and then work getting closer to that goal. So Nick just set very aggressive goals, which was usually like 10 times the baseline, which requires you to think differently because you can't get to the goal with small incremental changes, or at least not in the given time frame. So you had to think outside of the box and basically had to think, okay, how can I make big step changes?
Sorry to interrupt you, but part of like, when you look at that, if I was a salesperson working for a company, I'd get a target. My next quarterly target would be 30, 40% higher. Fine, fair enough. But if it would have been 300, 400% higher, then what do I do? What thinking paths does that entail? And in a competitive landscape, when there were how many other challenger banks were in the same, competing over the same demographic, over the same clicks?
I don't know, like, there was 5, 6, 7.
5, 6, 7.
But to be honest, like, you never lose. You never lose or get bankrupt or be not successful because of your competition. It's always your own choice. If you basically start factoring in like competition, basically you give away control. So for us, it was always about like, what do we need to do in order to be the number one? What do we need to do in order to be the most successful company? We didn't really look too much at competitors. I think like competitors, like you should be aware of what they're doing and you should be mindful about what they're doing. But in the end of the day, it's about how you execute your own job.
That is a very rare level of confidence for any company.
But it's like, if you look at professional football players like Messi or Ronaldo, they don't look at like what the other person is doing. They look at what they're good at and how they can become better, how they can train more, how to be faster, how they have better shots, like how the tactics of the team can be better. Because that's the only thing you can actually influence. You can't influence how the other team plays. It's the same in a company. You can't influence like how another company builds their product, how they, grow, what the strategy is, how much they raise. It's just not possible. So the only thing that you can actually influence is your own work.
First got a job, 100th employee, 700,000 people. This is the user base. How long did you stay with the company?
2.5 years.
2.5 years. Fast forward 2.5 years, 10 million customers, 2,000 employees, what does it feel like to work for a company that's going through hypergrowth?
it's it's quite challenging and demanding. It's basically like there's so much things to do, and you have to move so quick. You don't have much room for error, and in general, like it was quite challenging, but it was also like you learned a lot during the time, and it was also quite rewarding to see how many people you can, make happy and provide value to.
You said that it was challenging. Most people I know who work in the startup scene, when I ask them about their job, they would say it was challenging. But very few people have experienced hypergrowth. People have seen their company double in numbers, triple in numbers, but we're not talking double or triple. So what's the difference, in your opinion, between a hypergrowth environment that is growth at all costs versus we're demonstrating steady growth, which is what startups sometimes do?
I mean, the thing is so certain things like we couldn't influence, right? So like even if we stopped doing things, we still grew like super fast. So essentially, like if you have basically like the bigger you get, and if there's a lot of word of mouth happening, I mean, at some point you can't really stop it. The only thing what you can do is basically block people from signing up. So in a way, like every department, every individual in the company constantly had to adapt to the new challenges. And let's say in the beginning you have there's two metrics, for example. On one hand, you acquire more customers and you have your total user base. On the other hand, you have how many people are active on a daily basis. So now if you increase the ratio of total registered users to daily active users and grow faster, you basically have like nearly exponential growth. So it means that for every team, every day, everything becomes exponentially harder to do.
Wow.
And so that's why it becomes challenging, and that's why basically you need to focus more on solving big problems first, because you basically you don't have time to waste on smaller problems, because otherwise the whole thing will just fall on.
So you're constantly looking for the levers that will influence as many customers as possible.
Yeah, you constantly look at what are the biggest opportunities and what are the biggest problems, and you basically just focus on these things, and you make sure that you need to stay focused and you need to do these things. Otherwise, it will not end very well.
You said that there wasn't a lot of room for error, and in many working cultures that I've worked in, the CEO or whoever it is would say something like, "Guys, let's keep perspective. We're not brain servants. No one's going to die." But it sounds like you're describing a culture in which this is considered very high stakes.
Okay, I mean, let's put it this way. Like, we could make mistakes, and we did a lot of mistakes. It's impossible to innovate and to build something that didn't exist before if you don't make mistakes. Because essentially, like, everything you ship, everything you do, the main thing is always to constantly learn, to better understand, what actually works, what doesn't work, what do people care about, what do they not care about. So obviously you make constant mistakes, and that's a good thing, and that's also like embraced by the company, by the CEO, and so on. The thing is, like, if you have 1 million people, or nowadays even more, that use your product on a daily basis, where they have all the money or like a fraction of their money on their accounts, you can't really afford that your service is not accessible for a whole day, because essentially you lock out 1 million people from their money. So that's what I mean, like there wasn't much room for error, because we had the money of each individual customer at stake. And worst case, they can't pay the rent. Worst case, they can't eat food, they can't pay a hotel bill or can't get an Uber. So it's not like, you lock out of your Facebook account. I mean, it's actually your bank account. It needs to work.
Wow, I forget that it's actual people's lives. It's not just a luxury product. It's not a lifestyle product. It's actual people's money and their ability to flow through life, and they're trusting you to enable that. And that's something that, in a way, justifies aggressive culture, in the sense that we cannot afford to fuck that up, because that person's evening, month, whoever knows, is going to be ruined. And I think that is a part of innovation that we sometimes forget. There's so many silly startups. I don't want to diss anyone's visions, but a dog walking app that raises $300 million, I mean, okay, you're making some people's lives much more comfortable, but it's not a life or death. It's not more than an inconvenience if you get it wrong. But that's money, and money would get people to be.
Yeah, but to be fair, like, I mean, I don't even think we're like, I mean, obviously, financial companies are heavily regulated and there's a lot of controls in place and we have a lot of responsibility. On the other hand, I mean, if you work in, let's say, medicine, or if you work in space flights, or like, if you manufacture like airplanes, you have even more responsibility because you have less room for errors.
But if you're manufacturing airplanes, then the regulatory wall that is imposed on you, it won't let an airplane go up in the sky without you.
Well, I mean, if I mean, what happened to that one airplane? I think from
The Boeing ones?
Yeah, that basically had a software issue. It's the issue is like it's a lot of these things are very hard to test, and obviously there's a lot of controls in place to make sure or to mitigate that risk as much as possible. But like you never can rule out that there's a risk, right? So the whole idea from startups is always like, how can you move as fast as possible to make the biggest impact possible with the least damage you can do. And certain industries are more sensible, other industries are less sensible. But like, I think like some of the misunderstanding of the startup scene is that, you know, like companies don't care about revenue, companies don't care about unit economics, and you can just raise crazy amounts of money and making loss constantly, which is not true. I mean, if you look at Facebook, for example, Facebook made a profit from year one. They made in the first year already 400,000. I think in the second year 6 to 9 million, and then I think in the fourth year already 170 million. That wasn't a company that basically didn't make revenue. That's like they made mad profit from day one, and that's why they were so valuable. I think because the media usually wants to pick up the stories in that sense and create some sort of hype. A lot of the less experienced people then think, you know, that works that way, and then because, you know, there might be less experienced investors or less investors. Experienced entrepreneurs, you know, they start creating businesses that just don't have a proper business model, that don't have proper controls in place, they don't take things too seriously, and then usually that creates the issues.
It's like a cherry picking the part of the startup journey. Everyone admires the the move fast and break things, also a Facebook model, because it justifies recklessness and it just makes working, you know, in a not putting as much thought to the collateral damage of your work. Fine, but also, yeah, we actually have to build a profitable business for this party to keep going. So yeah, there is a bit of cherry picking in the startup scene, huh?
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's not very transparent, right? In the end of the day, nobody really, unless you worked for companies like Facebook, Uber, Apple, and so on, like how do you really know how things are working internally? How do you know like how processes are structured, how you actually have to do work, what targets are important? I mean, it's a lot of, you know, rumors and a lot of gossip, but in the end of the day, it's usually never really publicly documented. And because a company doesn't want to reveal the secrets to success and doesn't want to, you know, tip off competitors and these sort of things.
Yeah.
So in the end of the day, it's very hard to know for someone that never been in that environment how to do it the proper way. And for that reason, a lot of people try to copy it from the outside. And then obviously you do certain mistakes because you work with information asymmetry. But it's the same, like, let's say if you play poker and don't know the other person's card. I mean, how do you know what they have, right? So you try to make best educated guesses, and, you know, some people are better at this and some people are worse.
So let's finish that question about working for a 2,000 people company. So the Revolut you left to start Kiko, what did it look like in terms of what was it like coming into the office? Who are the people you worked with? Your access to the senior decision makers, your job. It's a very broad question, but try and describe what it felt like working for a hyper-growing 2,000 people company.
To be honest, it didn't really change too much for me over the 2.5 years. I worked mostly with the CEO, who was my line manager for the majority of the time. And then I worked with engineering and product teams. So I think initially it was a lot, like you had very small teams, very lean teams, where you had to do a lot of the work and you had to do things very fast. I think roughly after a year and a half, we needed to basically scale up the manpower in order to sustain the growth. So it was a lot more about hiring and finding the right people and then teaching people and, making sure that also your team skills, not just the user base.
I want to double click on the hiring part, because if this podcast is about startup nightmares, a lot of nightmares seeds are planted when you're only being fed of one part of the story.
Mm-hmm.
And that part would be, being the fastest growing tech company in the UK, one of the fastest fintech companies in the world, with a compelling vision that people want to take a part of. So what are some of the misconceptions people had coming into Revolut?
I mean, I think like it's similar to your product and how you do things internally. Like you get a better understanding over time how to hire the right people, which are the people that actually, like what is actually your company culture and how do you test people properly that these people then align with your culture? How do you make sure that you properly onboard them and teach them how to do things the Revolut way in that sense? And I mean, basically the way it works is like, you kind of do mistakes and then you try to, fix them and then make them better. So in the end, when I left, there was very rigid processes around how we hire people, how we interview people, how we rate them, about performance reviews. And so I think it made it easier, or it decreased the risk of basically hiring people that don't suit the style of Revolut. Which in the end of the day you want to avoid, right? Because it's not good for the company, because you basically don't have that employee that you really need. On the other hand, it's really bad for an employee because they're not very happy there and they don't enjoy it there. And then ultimately either they leave or, get moved on.
Yeah. And when you say the culture of Revolut, some people are familiar and some people are not. Can you describe briefly the ups and downs of working for a hyper-growing company with a compelling vision and an aggressive mindset?
I mean, I don't think there's like a one size fits all, right? I mean, culture often comes from the founders, and then every individual is slightly different. So to give an example, which is not directly related to the startup scene, but like if you look at the professional sports teams, let's say football, there's some teams that play with a lot of technique. They play beautiful football. They play a lot of ball possession, and there's other teams that are more like about running and fighting spirit and being aggressive. So there's no one way that is more successful, or there's no one way that is better. It's just a different style, and you need to make sure that you get the right players for the right style. And it's similar to companies, right? Like some companies are more like, there's certain companies that love remote work, and there's people like to be at home. They like to be able to work from anywhere. They like to work from whatever times they want to work. And there's other companies where it's more like an office culture where people should be in an office. So I personally just feel like it's on one hand, it's a responsibility of a company to test people, to make sure that you hire for the right, the right culture. On the other hand, it's a responsibility also of an employee to do a proper research and understand how the company really is, how it's working there, and if that's something I want to spend my time with.
So what advice would you give? I'm going to ask this twice. So the first time would be, what advice would you give people who want to go and work for a startup? They have startup experience, but they're not looking for the next play. How would you suggest they qualify and go about choosing their next workplace?
It's a difficult one. Personally, I think like a company like Revolut is not a startup. I mean, if you have 2,000 employees, you're a company, but you're not a startup. Because basically like a lot of the processes, there's so much structure already there. There's also a lot of hierarchy at that point, because it's otherwise impossible to make sure that 2,000 people move in the same direction. Personally, I think it's easier to learn in a smaller company, and also because you get more autonomy and there's less things defined. But it also depends on how you approach work and how you solve problems. If you're more kind of like, if you're more kind of like have a can-do attitude and you're very proactive, or if you're more kind of like the person that needs someone that tells you how to do things. But in general, I would say like you should care about the product. Like I would never work for a startup where I don't use the product. I don't get the point. Like, especially if you work in, if you're a product owner, you essentially can't improve a product if you don't actually use it yourself, if you don't understand the customer. And then the next thing is basically like looking at the founders. Are they ambitious? Because in the end of the day, a founder needs to spend more time than anybody else. They drive the company forward. And if the founders are not very focused, if they're not very committed to what the company should do, how would you? And then the third thing is you should know what you want to do in terms of like what kind of job you want to do. Like I never understood people, like I have so many people reach out to me and they basically send me their CV and then they're basically like, oh, can you tell me like what job works at that company for me? And you're kind of like, I mean, it's not really my job to do this, right? Like if you tell me what job you want to do, I might, can give you an introduction if you're relevant for it. But in the end, like you should be able to figure out what you actually want to spend your time on. If you want to do design, if you want to do marketing, there's so much reading material online, so many people that, have videos that explain certain jobs that in the end of the day, it just means that you're lazy and you don't want to invest your own time to figure out what you want to do in your life. I don't know, like it's I think if you don't know what you want to do, right, it's very hard to make sure that you can succeed. So for example, in my case, like I started software engineering, I then went to more design. I somehow ended up doing marketing because I was always interested in these things. Like I was kind of like, look, I know engineering, I'm not the best maybe, but like I'm at a good state of where I want to be. But like I want to learn about, how to market something because that's right now what interests me. And so like I kind of knew like this is a job that I want to, and then I was looking, okay, what companies currently offer that job? Or I mean, I started my first business like when I was quite young and like it didn't really work out.
How do you adapt to the changes of the role? So even without the role being officially changed, it's completely different. What advice would you give folks in order to help them adapt into the new roles within the same company?
Yeah. I mean, in the end, it's simple, right? Ask your line manager what are the expectations on you and then just do that.
You think that's simple, but how many of us miss that little
most people just don't ask a question. I mean, like if you join a new company, like there was a reason why somebody hired you. So the first thing I would do is like ask what would make my first 30 days or first 6 months successful in the company. And then basically would focus on these things.
What can you tell me about learning how to think? What does that even mean?
I value if people put in effort. I think there's actually a book about, like if you compare the most successful people, it's usually people that put in a lot of effort. Like, and it doesn't mean like you have to sit in an office for 60 hours or 80 hours, but like actually like that you spend a substantial amount of time on what you like doing. And the best people are the people that actually like what they're doing. Nobody forces them to do these things. They want to come in early. They want to leave late because they want to be the best in their field, right? You want to be the best football player. You want to be the best marketing person. You want to be the best product manager. And the thing is, like, the only thing that you can actually control is your effort. Like, it's very hard to control other things. But if you have that mentality to basically work harder than the rest and to basically catch up with other people, to learn more, to learn faster, it's very hard to basically compete with you, and you usually will be very successful. And I think nowadays in the media, like it's portrayed in a way that, you have all these super young people that have like this crazy positions or leading massive companies and they never worked hard, which is completely nonsense. I mean, if you hear the interviews of Bill Gates that he had, or Steve Jobs that they had multiple times all-nighters, that he didn't sleep for 3 days in a row, Elon Musk constantly sleeps in their own office. I mean, it's basically just work ethic, right? That you kind of like, you're so committed to your cause, you believe so much in it that you don't mind doing these things. I mean, there's a negative example, which is investment banking, where you basically force people to be in the office. So I think if you have that, if you have the work ethic, because you want to, you naturally will always learn faster. And then the second thing is like I feel like there's like nowadays people, like they have such a short attention span. So basically like you don't focus on one problem long enough and you never get deep enough to really understand it. And like, for example, in order to get that growth at Revolut, I spent over 9 months on referrals. I mean, the majority of all growth comes from one acquisition channel. And it was just because we did it over and over and over and over again. And we spend all our time, all our thinking just in how can we make this better? How can it, what's not optimal? Like what can be tweaked? What can be improved?
Working on the same problem for 9 months is a privilege that in many startups you don't have.
Well, you have it, just most people don't focus.
So that's my question. Is the conviction to focus on a channel, where is it coming from? Is it coming from a case study that you've seen and you're trying to replicate? Or an understanding that this is how your product is going to grow? Or just because you don't have any other options, because you don't have any money?
I mean, in general, like every company is different and everybody has like their own strengths. In general, there's only 3 acquisition channels that are basically that never run out. So usually, if you want to do growth, which is not marketing and so on, but growth basically means you build an automated systems that basically like brings you new customers without, spending time where you don't have a time constraint. So for example, if you're a salesperson, you actually have to call people. Let's say you're sick, nobody calls that person, so you don't close a deal. Like a growth system is automatically, like it works at night, it works on sick days, it just, So there's only 3, like if you think logically, there's only 3 acquisition channels worldwide that you never really explode. So one of them is you basically have the network of your users. So every new user will bring at least one more user. So, I mean, it's very rare that you don't have any friends or any family. So potentially with every new user, your network of potential users is getting bigger. The second thing is like ad networks. I mean, platforms like Facebook, Google are so big nowadays that you nearly can reach anyone in the world. And the third one is basically search. So if you use platforms like Google, Amazon, there's so many people looking for products and searching for products that it's nearly impossible to get all the traffic from these players. And these are the only 3 channels that will constantly drive more users. Everything else means that you basically need, it doesn't scale like, you don't have economies of scale. Essentially, like if you want to acquire more people, you need to hire more people. So if you look at companies like Salesforce, the only way for them to grow is to hire more salespeople. Because, that's what they do, right? They send someone to the office, they convince them, but like their whole approach doesn't work anymore, like if there's no salespeople. And so like the hard thing there is like you can't really reduce the cost of a new acquisition because, the only way to do this is either your existing salespeople need to close more deals, or they need to work longer, or they get a lower salary.
Yeah, that's a Salesforce is such a good example because with Salesforce, like they will sell you Salesforce. It's just a matter. Is it going to take them 3 months, 6 months, a year? But you are going to buy Salesforce eventually.
Yeah.
And they are relentless in that regard. And that's quite amazing.
But that's the thing is like, every company needs to know what their strengths and what their approach are. If you're a person that is good in sales, right, you should probably spend most of your time on sales. So the thing is, it's a myth, but like if you look at any company, they usually have 1 or 2 main acquisition channels. That's it. So Salesforce, for example, will never grow much through referrals. Revolut probably will never grow much through sales. But it's more like you need to know where you're strong at, and then you just focus on that channel over and over and over again. And if you look at companies like Revolut, Facebook, Airbnb, there doesn't seem to be really like a ceiling. So why not just focus on one thing and do it really well? I think it's also, what Google says, like do one thing, but do it really, really well.
In an environment with conflicting priorities, like startups, what feature do I develop? What next position do I hire? It's easier said than done.
If you think about it this way, it's about prioritization. So you have, the problem is basically you have limited, you have a time constraint, right? So like as a human person, you only have, let's say you sleep 6 hours, you have 18 hours. And that's the maximum time you can give. Then you probably commute, so you have 17 hours, and let's say you also want to have some freedom. So maybe you have 10 to 12 hours. In some cases, maybe you put 15. So that's the only time you have. So what you now need to think about is like, how to use your time the most efficiently. So like, what are the projects that make the biggest impact? And that usually goes like in terms of like looking at the competitive landscape, looking at competitors, looking at, the probability of success of certain things. And then just essentially spend a bit more time initially thinking through what is the right and the wrong thing, and then just doing these things. Because if you try to do one thing one day and the next thing next day, you never get that expertise and that understanding. I actually wanted to touch base on this. Like, so there's this saying from Steve Jobs, and I think it's super powerful, where he basically says like, once you realize that the world is built by no people smarter than by you, that's actually when you can start changing things. And like, if you think about it, like roads and houses and washing machines, like all of these things are not built by amazingly smart people. It's just like people focused on small things, and then the amount of all these different innovations and over time then generates what we live in. But like, you can't, like, it's not, nobody would be able to build just this world tomorrow.
It's funny because it brings us back to Pico and having the company on the road for 3 months and already planning for it to be in multiple cities, multiple continents. I want to ask you a little bit about choosing your pains, because working for a company like Revolut with an aggressive growth culture, with so many moving parts, and then choosing a different problem completely, which is being a business owner, with everything that comes with it, fundraising and hiring and multiple conflicting priorities and hustling. Like, do you take a paycheck out of the company?
Yeah, but not very high.
And how are you paying the employees? Did you already have the investment in?
Yeah, we raised.
Okay, so how long will that investment last?
Around 18 months.
Okay, 18 months in startup land. That actually means a year.
Yeah, you kind of have to raise again in a year.
And so.
But the idea is actually we're aiming to get it profitable from the beginning.
You take a skill set that you've owned, working for a unicorn, and you apply it on a company that's, how many, like 4 or 5 people now?
We're 5.
5 people. You'll be what, 15, 20 by the end of the year?
Yeah, that's kind of the time.
So you're a percentage of what you are when you're working for Revolut. You don't have the resources and the execution prowess.
Yeah, but you lean. It's also nice, right? It's like, you don't need all this overhead because you're a small team. You're 5 people. It's easy to communicate. Everybody knows what each other is doing. I mean, it has benefits and it has disadvantages. But like, I personally enjoy building product again. I like what I'm doing. There's actually like the Arnold Schwarzenegger like did one of his best speeches about. So he basically said like, he became the youngest Mr. Universe, and he was basically, I mean, he highlights kind of like his rules of success. And so the first thing was basically like love what you do. And he was basically saying like, look, the guy was like in the gym 5 hours, and like everybody looked at him. He's kind of like, why are you smiling? While he's working out like crazy. And he was like, well, every session, every workout gets me one closer to my step, or my goal to become the youngest Mr. Universe. So like he was happy about having that progress and feeling like he's one step closer to his goal. And it's, I think it's really important. It's the same with starting a business or doing your job. You need to enjoy what you're doing. Otherwise, you should quit. And if you really enjoy what you're doing, you don't mind spending, the weekends on it or long hours, because you're actually passionate about what you're doing. You're kind of like excited by it. You get a rush by, getting that next milestone done, or getting that first customer, or kind of making that first money, or making that first hire. So I think it's like, personally, if people don't enjoy that, they're probably not doing the right thing. And he basically mentioned that like, I think 70% roughly in the US and Europe, they basically hate their jobs, which basically is in general, like for me, the biggest issue. Second thing is, he basically said like time management. Like, you have 24 hours every day. Like, if you want to sleep 8 hours, just sleep faster. Sleep 6 hours. And then in the end, like, everybody has time to do an hour sports every day. Everybody has time to read an hour. It's just basically like priorities and like time management.
I want to try and do a broad stroke characterization of startup employees.
Yeah.
So there's the ones, well, people in general, but in our context, startups. One type of people are the ones that already know what they want to achieve. They've experienced enough, or they have this geniosity that says, I know what I want to do and nothing's going to stop me and I'm going to pursue it. Whether they succeed or fail, it doesn't matter, but it's that type of energy. There's the other ones who are optimizing for lifestyle. They want well-being, they want work-life harmony. And that's also fine. If you want to live in a suburb and have like a more mellow type of a lifestyle, that's okay. But there's a huge population that is in between, that wants to succeed and make it big, but not sure exactly how or why, or that they are willing to pay the cost. And that's an ever-growing demographic, because like the features you develop in your companies, so many business lines and opportunities and industries didn't exist 5 years ago. Any advice to the people who are feeling a little bit lost with the skills they have and the opportunities they have?
Take a vacation.
I
don't know, like, I think it's like, in general, like, I would work for a company where, for example, if it's a software company, I probably want to have that app on my phone. If I'm not using that app every day or like every week, I'm probably not very passionate about it. I feel like a lot of people don't really want to follow their dreams because they're afraid of failing. And I think, people fail all the time. There's nothing bad about failing. It's something that you get taught at school, that it's not good to be, to make mistakes. It's not good to do things wrong. But the thing is, like, it's not about if you do mistakes, because everybody does mistakes. It's just a matter of like what you learn from mistakes and how do you avoid making the mistake again in the future. And so I think people should have a bit more confidence. I think people should take a bit more risk. The way I always saw it is like, what's the worst thing that happens? Worst thing that happens is, like, in my case, like, I go back to my mom and, spend a bit more time with her.
Is that really such a good thing?
Yeah, it could be worse about it,
Yeah.
And I guess a lot of people have friends they can rely on. You could go to a cheaper, do you really need to spend, let's say, $2,000 or $1,000 on an apartment? You could go somewhere where it's cheaper, right? So there's always ways how you can, make sure that, like, you don't run, like, you don't have to go bankrupt and always go all in, but you can take risks in your life. And then, let's say if you're amazing at drawing, if you want to be an artist or graphic designer, why not go all in? Like, why not risk something? Worst case, in 6 months or a year, you realize, okay, it's not for me, and you do something else. People, I think, I personally, I admire people that, that follow their passion and follow their dream, because a lot of people don't do this anymore. And from a hiring perspective, you rather hire people that failed a few times, but they actually, they really want to try new things and want to succeed, than if you hire people that are kind of like, they don't really know what they're doing. They constantly, they're not very motivated. They're not very passionate with their job. Because it's very hard, in my opinion, to work with these people.
Yeah, it's hard to motivate them. It's hard to help them endure everything that comes with the turmoil and turbulence of working in such environments. One hiring tip I'd give to everyone who's listening is that I took that from Mike Gamson. He was VP Sales for LinkedIn. And his methodology that kind of trickled into LinkedIn is that he looked for two things when hiring. So you can do this in this country. Two things when hiring. So he looked for cultural fit, meaning a person that looks at the values of this company and they resonate. He doesn't look at them and say, ooh, what is this? Speaking of Revolut, I think that goes a long way.
Yeah.
If you're into that type of aggressive, competitive growth at all costs mentality, and you understand what you stand to gain from participating, fine. If not, don't try to change a company. Choose a different one. So that's one, cultural fit. And the other is a track record of excellence. So sometimes you have to hire people who haven't done that role before, either because you're going like crazy or because you can't afford them, or because they're the only one who's willing to work for you. So if you have to hire people and you can't base it on their professional record in that specific industry, try and base it on a track record of excellence. What have they done well in the past? Could be a swimmer, a trumpet player, or a private tutor. But knowing what excellent looks like is a huge motivator, and it helps you tap into that secret fuel, that secret purpose-driven energy that makes some companies amazing to work for and some companies amazing gifts to our world. Val, we're just about to wrap up. And before we wrap up, I wanted to give you a chance to add anything that you haven't spoken about before.
I think just to add, this is like you can, every day can be a new day and you can start being excellent, right? Just because you didn't have been in the past doesn't mean you can't do it in the future. The second thing is, I think it's really important about, like, most of the good companies don't hire based on CV or these sort of things. They hire based on like how you think. Like, if you want to work in product, it's very important, like, to understand basically like how to solve problems, right? How to be, to have the right mentality and the right approach to work, and less so about the right experience, because all these things you can learn on the fly. But like, if you don't know how to structure things, if you don't know how to analyze a problem, I mean, it's very hard to teach you these things. I mean, especially in that given time frame. So I think that's like the best thing. I would basically like have confidence. I would know what I want to do, and then I basically like, like you can start every day new. Like if you never worked in, I don't know, being an artist, or if you never had an excellent track record, but then you put in the hours and you spend time at home to practice and you get feedback from other people. I think if you stick to it, you probably will be good at some point.
Let me break down what you just said, because I think it's a super valuable list of advice. One, immerse yourself in the world that you're looking to enter. If it's a company or a role or a function, just immerse yourself, surround yourself, touch everything you can in that regard. And the second thing is have a variety of experiences. So like you've gone from software engineering to design, to product, to marketing, to growth. So that variety helps you better understand what you're good at, what you enjoy doing, back into tapping into that secret fuel. And lastly,
it also helps you, to think differently. So if you're like a designer, right, you're very creative. Most designers are very, like, you don't have a very straight thought process, because you basically get in a lot of information, like a lot of different inspiration, designs, emotions, and then at some point it just clicks and you can come up with a solution. If you kind of like doing software engineering, it has to be very structured and logically, because basically like that's how code is written, right? Like it's very like you need to abstract a problem, and then if you do marketing, it's a lot about emotions of people, like how do people feel about something, how do people reason about something, and each of these approaches like forces you to slightly think differently. And if you look at the most successful people like Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, they had like excellence in different fields, and they could see things and connect things that other people couldn't. So for example, Steve Jobs, like he started with electronics. He built, I think, machines where he could call anyone in the country for free. And then basically like he designed some computers and other stuff. But he also did business. He was interested in business. And he basically like did calligraphy and these sort of things. So when he started creating the Mac, like he combined all his knowledge, because he knew how important it is to have easy access to things and easy, good user experience.
Yeah.
He knew how important it is to have good fonts and these sort of things.
The alchemistry from combining several different disciplines is greater than the sum of its parts. And I think that's the silver lining of living in an environment where so many jobs didn't exist 5 years ago and won't exist in 5 years. And there's so many opportunities. So those opportunities also help you unearth areas of growth and synergies that didn't exist before. Val, you've had a remarkable career, and the majority of it is still ahead. I am so looking forward to seeing what you and Kiko are up to in the next few years. But before we say goodbye and thank you for today, I wanted you also to give you a chance to say thank you for someone who helped you tremendously in your career, and kind of acknowledge their contribution to the success that you've experienced. So if there's anyone in the world that you feel indebted to, this would be a great time to tell them that.
There were a lot of different people, but like I think actually my parents, like the way I was raised, like I can take a lot of risks and it doesn't really matter, because I know worst case I can always go back home. And I guess not everybody has that in the world, but like that's one of the reasons why I left Revolut, for example, because I was like, what's the worst thing that happens if Kiko doesn't work out? So I think it's really important to have some sort of safety net that you can rely on, and also have people that support you in that sense.
If our listeners and viewers want to reach out to you and ask for advice, what's the best way to get in touch?
Best thing is LinkedIn.
Best thing is LinkedIn. And if they want to learn more about Kiko and how they can get involved?
It's kiko.homes.
Kiko.homes. Val, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. Congrats on launching Kiko. I hope to see you in the rooftop summer party in 3 or 4 months. Thank you so much, buddy.
Thanks.